Thank you. So what I'm going to present today is a very specific historical episode. So I just want to start by reminding you about a little bit about the context and about why it is interesting to reflect about citizenship and mobility. So it's and for those of you who are not familiar with this geographical zone, it regards the Roya Valley, which is at the frontier between France and Italy. And I will show you then, I will show you after the frontier shift. What is important to understand in terms of context is that it's an episode that is at the same time extraordinary in the sense that it's a vote about national belonging, about a change of national belonging. And at the same time, it's microscopic. The population concerned is difficult to estimate precisely, but at the maximum, it regards 5,000 persons. So it's a very small population, which is unusual for a national electoral law. And that's part of the interest of this case, is that it will enable us to look at the choices that are made in a national law, the choices that are meant to define an electorate. And since the population is so small, it's pretty easy to put into regards these criteria with the actual population, the actual target population, its social composition. And so the way that the person that defined these criteria, I will go back to that, expect these criteria to have political effects and to have an influence on the result of the vote. In this case, who decides of these criteria, it's important to remember that the vote happens after the change of sovereignty. So this is also a little extraordinary. That is to say, the vote does not, strictly speaking, decide of the change of sovereignty. It's already decided by the Peace Treaty of 1947. But the new state, France, decides to have a vote about this change of sovereignty. The idea, of course, is to legitimate this frontier shift after a complex story that I won't detail now. But so the new state is in position of defining alone the composition of the electorate. And of course, the idea is to define an electorate that's going to enable the desired result to happen. So this is what I'm going to be looking at in more detail, drawing on historical work, of course, since this is in 1947. So drawing on archives, both on the French and the Italian side. And in particular, I've been looking at the archives of foreign affairs ministries. And what is interesting is that in this, even in the national archives as this one, you will find very detailed and very specific reports about the local activities, not only the local political activities, which can seem pretty obvious given the situation, but also the everyday life in these villages, in these mountain villages that have been pretty much, that are still affected by the post-war context. And so the quality of bread distributed by either Italian or French or allied troops, really the everyday life in these villages, with the idea that this will have an impact again on the vote and on the results of the vote. So this is the detail of the frontier shift. Basically, the Roya Valley is still divided after the frontier shift, but instead of having the low valley that is in Italy, in Italy, the Middle Valley in France, and the High Valley in Italy. So instead of having 3 parts, there are 2 parts, which is the actual situation. That is to say, the High and the Middle Valley are in France, and the Low Valley is still in Italy. In this case, the villages concerned are Tende and La Brigue, and Saint-Dalmas, which belongs to Tende. So this is where the vote takes place. And what I'm going to be looking at today in more details are really these criterions for selecting voters. I'm not going to present in detail the vote in itself, even if it's present in the article, and we can go back, we can talk about it during the Q&A, but I really want to stop on these criteria. So the first criteria to be discussed and to be examined on both sides is the residence criteria. It's common in referendums, in electoral consultations about change of sovereignty to exclude a part of the population that is recently arrived, especially if you consider that its arrival was the result of a kind of colonization process. So it's common that the voters may not be exactly the population that is in the territory at that time. In this case, the idea was that the zone, the high Roya Valley, was concerned by different immigration waves from the rest of Italy, because it was Italian. In particular, since the end of the 19th century, in particular in Saint-Dalmas de Tende, there was an important industrial development. So migration happened because of the development of a new economic activity with the construction of a railroad line, with a hydroelectric power station, with the exploitation of the forests, of a mine, of a quarry. And so in a zone that was mostly agricultural and a pastoral one, this new kind of activity also brought new populations, and in particular, working class migrants from Italy. The fact that it was Italian also included a specific state-linked migration, state servants, in particular customs and military personnel. And this kind of presence rose just before the war, during the 1920s and 1930s, especially in the context of the fascist regime, who, let's say, stressed and paid more attention to its frontier and to its prestige on its frontiers. So the idea was to add to the criterion of residence a criteria of duration. The idea was that the most recent waves of immigration could not be taken into account. On the French side, there was the idea that there was an Italianization operation, that is to say, a voluntary migration in order to have a more Italian population, which of course on the Italian side didn't seem to make sense, because the zone was Italian, so it could not be made more Italian than it was. But so the discussion was on when this criteria of duration, this criteria of residence should start. Should it be 1922, that is the start of the fascist regime? If you consider that after the start of this regime, there was a specific political immigration. Should it be in 1930? Should it be in 1940? That is to say, the start of the war. And in the end, the choice of the French authorities is to consider the most strict version of this criteria, that is to say, people who were residents before 1922. The second criteria was the birth one, or the blood one, we could say, but I will go back on that, why birth is not necessarily a jus sanguinis. The idea of incorporating into the electorate people born into the zone was that it enabled to incorporate immigrants, especially immigrants in France, but of course also immigrants in the rest of Italy. And the idea to understand how these criteria would play in this specific context, we have to understand that there were zones with seasonal migrations, which are absolutely not specific to the Roya Valley, which are really typical of alpine zones and of agricultural and pastoral activities. In this mountain zone, only a very small part of the environment is cultivable. So most of the activities are anyway mobile activities inside the mountains to exploit the forests, to gather mushrooms, strawberries, different kind of natural resources. So even inside the mountain, the activity would be mobile, and in reality, villagers would only stay inside the village during the winter months. This seasonal migration inside the mountain was also, in some cases, a seasonal migration between the mountain and the coast, especially for pastoral activities. So that was, again, that's pretty typical of these mountain alpine zones. It took a specific direction in the case of the Roya Valley, first because of the political divisions of the valley and the fact that the low valley belonged to the Republic of Genoa, whereas the high valley belonged to the Nice county, and so migration were also oriented toward Nice. And from the second half of the 19th century, the development of winter tourism in Nice, in Monaco, in Cannes, on the Côte d'Azur, gave also a new importance to this seasonal migration, especially because it was specifically adapted to the rhythm of agricultural activities and pastoral activity. That is to say, the winter months are anyway the months in which almost no activity is possible in the mountain. And so this seasonal migration expanded and developed in link with Nice, with the Côte d'Azur, and in some cases became permanent migrations. So you would find an important waves of immigration, seasonal and in some cases definitive, toward France, toward the Côte d'Azur, who crossed the existing border without any problem until the 1920s. And when the zone began to be claimed as French, the beginning of the process started with emigrants from the Roya Valley living in Nice. So it was the Comité de Rattachement of Tende and Labrique to France really was created among the emigrants of the Roya Valley in Nice in the time period where Nice was already freed from the German troops, whereas the Roya was not yet. So they really develop a conception of belonging to the villages that makes the immigrants central and make their role really central. Indeed, they are central in this process of claiming the zone as French. That is pretty complex, and I cannot develop in detail. But what they claim is not only to take birth into account, to take into account the fact of being born in the zone, but more broadly, they claim for taking into account the fact of belonging to a local family. So even not being born in the zone, but having parents or grandparents born in the zone should also be taken into account. So that's what they advocate for, is really broader in a sense than just the place of birth, but it's really a jus sanguinis, which is not completely accepted by the French authorities, that do not give the right to vote based on birth only, but mix the fact of being born there with the fact of residing in the zone or having parents born in the zone. So which is a stricter definition of the electorate that the Comité de Rattachement would have wanted, and that in fact excludes some of its members. So with these two criterions, you have the creation of a new electorate that is pretty much expected to be the most favorable to the change of sovereignty and to the rattachment to France. So as you can see in this image, the sovereignty shift is already into effect. It came into effect on the 15th of September 15th. And so in October, you have the registration to vote in the town halls, or before the town halls in this case. And you can see on the picture that the farmacia is still a farmacia. So some signs are still in Italian. It's really the installation of the new French administration. So with this new Francophile electorate, the idea is that the vote can take place respecting legal rules and formal rules, but the most important explanation, the decisive element of this election is really the composition of the electorate. So I don't want to, as I told you, I won't go into detail in how the vote really went. The idea is that even France asked for international observers, and it's probably one of the first episodes of international observation of elections. And what the report said, what the Italian Carabinieri report said, was that globally the vote, the ballots were regular. There were no evidence irregularities in the vote in itself, but what was really present was the presence of emigrants. So emigrants that didn't come from Italy, but that came from France, with buses, with different collective transportation for them. And so in the article, I cite different testimonies of persons who remember the day of the vote as a day of return of the immigrants, of retraveling of family members that didn't came to the villages for a long time, that sometimes didn't speak the local language, that sometimes didn't even know the ways, never came before to these villages. So this is legal. This is completely conform to the criteria defined by the law. Still, it shows a specific definition of who belongs to these villages, who is legitimate as an actor in these villages. And these definitions clearly are centered around this figure of the immigrant. What I want to stress, the last point I want to stress is that these ways of belonging to the village are pretty different when it comes to voting, and then when it comes to naturalizing a few months and a few years after that. And that's interesting because in a way, the successive French laws have different definitions of what it is to belong to the village and to be able to vote in order to decide of the village national belonging, and a different definition of what it is to belong to the nation, to the country as a person, and to naturalize individually, so that to individually change nationality. So the general rule for nationalizing is that that's organized by the peace treaty, is that all the residents of the ceded territories by default became French, and only those who made a voluntary went through a voluntary procedure could stay Italian. But the general rule was that they became French, as long as well, they were not before, and they were residents in the zone in 1940. So as you see, the criteria is different, and indeed it excludes from the French nationality a part of the persons that voted for this referendum. In particular, for the referendum, persons that were already French, that had the French citizenship, could vote, which is not the case, of course, in this, which is a difference. And people who had their residence from 1992, so people who left the zone between 1922 and 1940 could vote, but then were not able to naturalize. This led to a new mobilization of emigrants in order to have a new law that took place, and it's really important, the date is really important, in 1949, that is to say just before the first municipal elections in the zone. And so, of course, changing the composition of, changing the ability to naturalize changes also the electoral body for these municipal elections. So the two questions are always intertwined. In this case, the Comité de Rattachement finally made it to have its vision of belonging to the villages recognized by a national law again. That is to say, it was enough to be born in the zone, or to have parents or grandparents born in the zone. So that's a much more jus sanguinis definition of belonging to the villages. That is to say, being of local descent, being a member of a local family is enough to have the French citizenship in this specific case. So that's really a law that's specific to the Roya Valley, and of course doesn't apply to the whole French territory. In conclusion, I want to use this example to stress the ambivalence of the birth criterion. When we think of this legal criterion, depending on the cases, depending on the way it applies to a specific population, it can refer to the place of birth, which is different from filiation, and it is often a combination of the two. That's the case in the first French jus soli, because which combines the place of birth and the fact of being born of parents themselves born in France. So that's a double jus soli. The fact of having parents born in France is in a way an indicator of residence, even if it's not formally defined, if there's no formal residence criteria. So depending on if this birth criteria is associated with the place of birth, or if it's associated with filiation or the combination, it refers to a logic of jus soli or a logic of jus sanguinis. So that's also a way of encouraging you to examine these legal criteria with attention to the social and political situation they apply to, because they will have different effects depending on the population, the social and political context they are gonna meet. Thank you for your attention.